So now we're going to take a look at some of the new features in terms of SharePoint 2013 and how that affects administrators. So the first thing that you'll note is that there is a change in the version of Windows and the version of SQL which is supported. SharePoint 2010 supported older versions of Windows Server and older versions of SQL, but now you're effectively limited to either Windows Server 2008 R2 SP1 or Windows 2012. Now you may note in my demos I am running Windows 2012. That said, I'd say the majority of our clients still use 2008 R2 SP1. However, it's getting almost to the point where about half and half of new deployments start to use 2012 over 2008 R2. And I think the only real lag in adoption has been the fact that Windows Server 2012, if you didn't notice it, it's using the the Metro UI type interface. So if you're not familiar with this Metro UI interface and how to use this and how to have all the various charms and things come up, you're going to have some trouble or you're going to have a learning curve in trying to administer an environment. It does take a while to get used to this. But it's definitely the way that Microsoft's moving on it. They are making some changes in the 8.1 version of this interface, but it is something that I would say you're going to have to get used to moving forward. So it's either decide today to kick the can down the road and deploy your servers in 2008 R2 SP1, which is perfectly acceptable, or you could deploy them on 2012. And I can say that 2012, either version works really well for SharePoint. Feature-wise, there's virtually no features in Windows 2012 from a SharePoint perspective that increase anything that SharePoint can do. From a virtualization perspective, there are some significant features, however. Virtualization-wise, the version of Hyper-V that runs with Windows 2012 is much superior than the version that ran with 2008 R2 SP1. So if you're looking at it from a host perspective, and if you are using Hyper-V, I would highly recommend 2012. Otherwise, we're okay recommending either version for our clients. Now, from a SQL Server perspective, it's a little different in that it does support both SQL 2008 R2 SP1 or SQL 2012, but we highly recommend SQL 2012 as opposed to using the older versions. And a lot of that really is because there are some significant features in SQL 2012 that can help you from a SharePoint perspective. So there's a lot of features around high availability, what are called the always-on feature sets, which we'll be taking a very close look at during that module, the SQL module. And also there's a lot of new business tools, new and improved versions of reporting services, analysis services that allow you to do things, complex power pivot tables within SharePoint. A lot of the business intelligence features that were lacking before are now possible, but only if you're running SQL 2012 on the back end. So highly recommended if you are building an environment from scratch to run it on SQL 2012. However, it does support 2008 R2 SP1 if you need to. Now, one of the things that trips up some people as well when they're planning for SharePoint 2013 are the requirements around the memory and processor of the machines themselves. You need a lot more memory than you needed to on previous versions. Microsoft's recommendations have gone up. I've included a table here that kind of shows some of these recommendations. Keep in mind, these are the bare minimum for a server. This is where you start on a server that's handling just 5 users, for example. So we generally just go up in terms of the amount that we allocate for individual machines themselves. One of the things people don't realize, for example, is that every application pool that you use on a SharePoint web role server consumes an additional 800 megabytes of memory on that machine. So these numbers here are assuming a single app pool, for example. Anytime you add an additional app pool, suddenly you need to add at least 800 megs or probably preferably a gig of extra memory onto every web front end that runs that app pool. So these numbers are really the base starting point. You'll note I did put what we call the all-in-one server, which has everything running on it. That's SQL Server, web, service application. That's not a recommended configuration. We try to avoid using that, and I'll discuss more in a future slides here. But basically, you will note, of course, that also has some really significant memory requirements. If you want to just stand up a single server, that's 24 gigs of RAM and at least 4 CPUs that are allocated to that machine. So we're talking some significant levels of resources, even for lab environments. My lab environment's running 10 gigs of RAM for each one of my SharePoint servers, and then I've got a separate SQL server as part of it as well too. And it runs fairly slow in terms of SharePoint functionality. Okay, a few changes were made to the service application model. The service application model was introduced in SharePoint 2010. It replaced what was called the shared service provider in SharePoint 2007. And the service application model was very flexible in that it provided this middle tier of various services which are consumed by servers both within the farm and then also outside of the farm. SharePoint 2013 maintained that same service application model, but they did make a few changes to it. One that I already mentioned is that Office Web Apps is no longer a service application. Another one is that Web Analytics is no longer its own service application itself. It now runs as part of the search service application itself. But Microsoft also added in a few new service applications that you might have noticed on the prior table that I had listed there. One of them is called the App Management Service. And the App Management Service is a service that's used to actually manage a lot of those the applications that what are called SharePoint apps that run within the SharePoint space. So if I go take a look, I've got an app section now within SharePoint Central Administration that allows me to go ahead and purchase different apps from the SharePoint store. Basically, different third-party companies can create apps to do specific services that get installed on your machine, much in the way that there are app stores for iPads and iOS devices and Android devices and Windows Mobile Marketplace. It's a very similar concept in that someone can create an app. You can go browse through different apps. You can manage the licenses to those apps. Of course, first you have to turn them on, but basically, it's an area that allows you to buy, install those apps, and then manage them. And that app management service application itself manages all of the different licenses and keeps track of who's using the licenses within that farm. So it allows for you to have better awareness of what's going on within the farm itself. The other service applications that were added include SharePoint Translation Services, which is a very interesting service app in that it allows you to do on-the-fly translation of documents from within your repositories. So you can actually have documents that are written in English, for example, sent out into the cloud, into Microsoft's Bing Translation Services, translated into one of 36 different languages, and then downloaded directly into a different SharePoint document library. So the translation services service application is what handles those particular tasks. Other service applications include Work Management Service. That's just a service application that allows for a task status to be updated in between SharePoint, Exchange, and Project Server. So for example, if you have a task that's listed in Outlook, you could mark it as complete, and that would go then and synchronize that status with the SharePoint site where the task came from, or the Project Server site where you're working on a particular project and you have specific tasks. So those are the, in addition, by the way, there's one last one, and that's a new version of Access Services. Now, if you're installing service applications, you'll note that you have actually an option to choose either between Access Services 2010 or Access Services 2013. The 2013 version of Access Services works in very different ways than the 2010 does. It's more powerful, but it also does things like create its own database for each Access app that you have running. So you end up with a bunch of new SQL databases. It's something you definitely want to plan for. So powerful, but something, if you are looking at it, make sure you understand the implications of using it. Another major change that was made in terms of allowing SharePoint to be more enterprise scale was the addition of a service called the Distributed Cache Service. Now, the Distributed Cache Service basically keeps cache information in sync between multiple web role servers. So it's basically meant for fairly large clients that have some large environments. They may have multiple web role servers, and they want to improve caching and improve the time that pages refresh by keeping cache information in sync between those servers. So the distributed cache service, it can be turned on via the Services tab. Now, if you do have an environment that just has a single web role server, it really would do nothing by having it turned on. But with multiple servers, it would allow you to improve the refresh time of your page by keeping cache information in sync between the different servers. And then another tool that was made for the very large enterprise clients is a tool called Request Management, or RM. And what Request Management does is it allows SharePoint to have much more knowledge over the type of requests that are coming to it. For example, you can now break up the requests by the type of client that's making the request. So you could say, I want all iPad traffic that's hitting my SharePoint site to actually go to a specific set of servers which are optimized to handle iPad traffic. Or you could, for example, use the request management service to determine that one of the servers is under too much load, and therefore another server should pick up the slack from that machine, and it'll send the request over to the other server itself. So it allows you, it gives you things like the user agent string, the requested URL, source IP. All of that information then can be used to create different rules within request management to decide how you handle this inbound traffic and what you do with it. Again, it's not really going to be useful unless you have an environment that's, in this case, even over more than 2 servers. But for large environments, it does allow you to get more sophisticated with what you do with the traffic itself. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is not something you'll even see within SharePoint Central Admin. The only way to configure request management is via PowerShell. And I think Microsoft did that because they didn't want people just playing around with it. They wanted to make sure that only people that needed those type of enterprise features could use them.